words, intensive schooling, in other words, to catch up. There's a lot of information and knowledge, basic knowledge. We're not even talking about anything like,
well, what they've basically done was to invert, they inverted the story. That's what they really did. When you really look at it, they inverted the story. They flipped the story on its head with this whole lie dissemination and dissimulation of the Ethiopians being Caucasoid or Caucasians and the Ethiopians being Aryan. And unfortunately, a lot of ignorant, misinformed Ethiopians who are Ethiopically illiterate and on a good level illiterate because of what has happened that has adversely affected the Ethiopian culture and civilization over the last centuries and perhaps even millennia, if we would do a fuller study and bring the documentation and information together. But the Ethiopians are not Caucasoid, Caucasian, and the Ethiopians are not so-called Aryan. We discussed some of the basics in the first part of this address because we saw there was a subscriber who had made a comment, had come across what they regard as a disturbing video. But this just shows how ill-informed that we are. We as people, those of you who are conscious and even semi-conscious, who really are interested and feel like, wow, I didn't know this. There are some very good books and resources, many of them that you can obtain, at least get an insight into free with the internet, the media, and other means out there, other brothers, sisters, and Bible studies and other groups. Ones can come together and really, begin to each one teach one. So if you just come across this information or disinformation that's being put out there about the Ethiopians being Caucasian or Caucasoids and the Ethiopians being Aryan, they want to take the Ethiopians out of the so-called Negroid family. But you have to remember that this so-called Table of Nations, or at least the Eurocentric racist interpretation, misinterpretation of the Table of Nations, is something that's racist white supremacy. You'll send that so-called white supremacy has put out. That's white supremacy and this whole Herrenvolk philosophy, the devil's philosophy that's gone out about the white man, you understand, is the perfect man, and these other people are latecomers and like troglodytes and animals and so forth and so on. But if you really look at European studies, not all Europeans were agreed about that. You understand, many Europeans had acknowledged the truth in their writings, saying that the Ethiopians basically are Hamite peoples, and it's from that Ham in the Bible who they call the black one, according to their pseudo-religious interpretation. What they've done basically, just to sum it up a little basically, we'll try to go into more detail, y'all willing, is that they flipped it on its head, saying that the Ethiopians are Caucasoid and Aryans, instead of saying it as it really is, and as the evidence provides us, that the Europeans, so-called Europeans and so-called Caucasians, CaucAsians, and the so-called Aryans actually come from the Ethiopian or the Hamite, the Kamite, and the Shemitic stock, if you understand. They're not Semites. People always say that the Europeans are Semites. No, what happened is through this intermixing and this mingling among the dominant gene and the recessive gene. You see, white supremacy tells us that there are three races according to their biblical and their pseudoscience. So pseudoscience, evolution, and all these other European teachings that have come out, the scientific so-called enlightened man. During enlightened man, they were saying this is where the European is like God and everyone else is like various levels, stages of animal forms, and so forth and so on. And then they had to back it up for the religious folks. You understand? For the religious folks. So each one backed up the scientific part of white supremacy, backed up the religious part of white supremacy. So religiously we have the Ham, Shem, and Japheth misinterpretation. Yes, there's a Ham, Shem, and Japheth, both historical and metaphorical or so-called mythological. That's true. But to say that three distinct races came from that, it just backs up neatly into their pseudo-scientific philosophy, which they say this is science, this is math, this is numbers, it cannot be wrong. And a lot of black folks, a lot of our people have believed it, and many still believe it, you understand, they be naive. This is part of what happened at the tree of knowledge. Remember the tree of knowledge? Knowledge is scientia. Science equals knowledge. So based on this pseudoscience, people believe that there are three races. But then the Bible, the very same Bible they point to, in the beginning, before Genesis, like chapter 9 and 10, before that, if we go back to in the beginning, we find out there's two seeds. There's a seed of the woman, which is a prototype of the Oset, the Isis, which is a prototype of the black maiden Mariam, or so-called Virgin Mary, the Holy Virgin Mary. You understand? The black Madonna, so that black woman. And we can go and look at the historical evidence that the black woman, and scientific evidence that the black woman is that mother. So we find that what the Bible is pointing to, you understand, is backed up scientifically. But then there's another seed. So there's one seed that will come through the Haywan, the Imahiyal, and there's another seed that comes through the Ibab, the Nahas. You understand? So there's a dominant seed genetically, there's a dominant gene, and there's a recessive gene. So we know that white comes from black. But what they're trying to say is that these black people actually come from white people. So they're trying to reverse, you understand, flip it on its head. Just like when they do with the star, the five-pointed star. Remember we talked about the five-pointed star? And they flip it on its head. And when we have the five-pointed star flipped on its head, that is called the Baphomet. They say the Baphomet, the Satanistic star. But if you could read the Hebrew that's around this particular five-pointed star, which five-pointed star rightly standing represents the symbolic of the woman. Therefore, the black maiden Mariam and that Oset Isis type, the black mother, the black maiden mother, the black mother type, because that black gene, that mitochondrial DNA. You see, that's where the proof and that's where the truth really is. But they flip it on its head. So they flip the five-pointed star on its head to create Satanism, Luciferianism. This all goes back to the mythology or the metaphor that we have in the garden. But what's happened for most religious folks, Christians, so-called Jews, and others out there, even the black so-called pseudo semi-conscious ones, is that they borrow and they swallow whole what the Europeans have said and just blackwash it. Just black. They paint over it black. They black eyes it. But they don't really break down the disinformation that's out there, and this is what prolongs the curse of this very same thing called Leviathan, the curse of Leviathan.